Okay, we now begin Chapter 9, The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control, Menticide and Brainwashing, by Just A.M. Merleau, M.D. Fear as a tool of terror. The fear of living. In our era, the fear aroused by human relationships is so strong that inertia and mental death often seem more attractive than mental alertness and life. Classical psychology often spoke of the fear of death and the great unknown as the cause of many anxieties. But modern psychological studies have shown us that the fear of living is a much greater, deeper, and more frightening one. Living often seems beyond our power. Stepping out of a relatively safe childish dependence into freedom and responsibility is both hazardous and dangerous. Living demands activity and spontaneity, trial and error, sleeping and reawakening, competition and cooperation, adaptation and reorientation. Living involves manifold relationships, each of which has thousands of implications and complications. Living takes us away from the dream of being protected and demands that we expose our weaknesses and strengths daily to our fellow men, with all their hostilities as well as their affections. It requires us to build up useful defenses and then to replace them with others because we have to change our goals and our relationships. It expects us to be lonely in order to cooperate in freedom. It asks us to submit and to conquer, to adjust and to rebel. It robs us of our childhood slumber of satisfaction and of the magic, omnipotent fantasies of our infancy. Living requires mutuality of giving and taking. Above all, to live is to love, and many people are afraid to take the responsibility of loving, of having an emotional investment in their fellow human beings. They want only to be loved and to be protected. They are afraid of being hurt and rejected. We can see this clearly in the fact that so many people embrace so fervently all the limitations and frustrations of life that are offered them, the neurotic limitations of the usual prejudices or the totalitarian limitations imposed by power politics. In his book, Escape from Freedom, Erich Fromm describes clearly how the pressures of freedom, when they are not balanced by responsibility and understanding, can drive men into the totalitarian frame of mind and into surrender of their hard-won liberties. Such surrender is nothing less than a slow mental death. Totalitarian leaders, whether of the right or of the left, know better than anyone else how to make use of this fear of living. They thrive on chaos and bewilderment. During unrest in international politics, they are most at ease. The strategy of fear is one of their most valuable tactics. The growing complications of our civilization and its administration make the impact of power politics felt more than ever before. When the totalitarians add their tactics, all the clever tricks that we have already discussed, Pavlovian conditioning, repeated suggestion, deconditioning through boredom and physical degradation, they can win their battle for the control of man's mind. In the earlier chapters of this book, we described in some detail the techniques by which man could be turned into a robot in the service of totalitarianism and some of the tendencies that operate, even in the free countries, to rob man of his mental integrity. It is important for us to realize that emphasis on conformity and the fear of spontaneous living can have an effect almost as devastating as the totalitarians' deliberate assault on the mind. Conformity and the fear of living rob the free way of life of its greatest asset in the struggle against totalitarianism. Our human strength lies in our diversity and independence of thought, in our acceptance of nonconformity, in our willingness to discuss and to evaluate various conflicting points of view. In denying the diversities of life and the complexity and individuality of the human mind, in preaching rigid dogmas and self-righteousness, we begin gradually to adopt the totalitarian attitude we deplore. Delusion has never been the exclusive property of any one country, class, or group, and the totalitarian delusion, which in itself promotes menticide, can invade us from many fronts, from the right as well as the left, from the rich as from the underprivileged, from the conservatives and from the rebels. Fear and intimidation have not always been the result, but also the tools of mental coercion. Although there is as yet no unified theory of fear and anxiety, and we therefore do not know precisely why and how the development of these feelings lead to such dire consequences, it is important for us to understand what useful tools fear and panic are, and to see through description what these overwhelming emotions are able to do to people. Most people think of fear reactions as hysterical expressions of desperation, but as this chapter should make clear, fear and panic also have their paradoxical expressions in indifference and apathy, reactions which, just because they are less commonly recognized as fear created, can be much more dangerous to the individual than a good hysterical cry. It is the hidden silent fears that have such an impact on our social and political behavior. Fear and panic are reactions not only to overt danger and threat, they are also reactions to the slow seeping intrusion of disquieting propaganda and the constant wave of suggestion to which we are all exposed. Fear is at work all around us, and often it throws its shadows where we least expect to find them. We may be acting out of fear without even knowing it. We may consider that our behavior is perfectly normal and rational when, in fact, psychology tells us that creeping fear may already have begun to work on us. Fear and catastrophe fortify the need to identify with a strong leader. They lead to herding together of people who shy away from wanting to be individual selves any longer. They prefer to be part of a huge mystic social organization that protects against threat and distress in oneness with the leader. This protection-seeking instinctual reaction is also directed against dissent and individualism, against the individual ego. We see in this a regression toward a more primitive state of mass participation. True, this process of ego shrinking is the negative side of the back-to-mass reaction, yet it stimulates a recognition of greater need for cooperation and mutual help. During the last war and the generally experienced emergencies, many people became for the first time aware of the effect ties they had. During the last war and the general experienced emergencies, many people became for the first time aware of the effective ties they had with their neighbors. At the same time, anxiety can inspire suspicion and the need for seeking scapegoats. It is the paradox of fear that it propagates warm feelings of immature ties and cold suspicion at the same time. Although there is throughout the world a conscious trend toward overcoming fear and feelings of insecurity, there is also a less conscious countercurrent provoking new fears and anxieties and insecurities. Whether he is aware of it or not, modern man lives in an atmosphere of fear. Fear of war, fear of the H-bomb, fear of totalitarianism, fear of nonconformism, fear of dissent. Fear has already begun to influence our behavior by the time we are aware of it. Once fear has penetrated the mind and stimulated fantasy, it begins to direct our actions, whether we want it to or not. We cannot eliminate all the thousands of stresses and fear-provoking situations in the modern world, but we can learn to recognize and understand some of the most common forms of fear reactions. In this way, we can find a partial release from the tensions they create and can learn how to cope with them more effectively. And that was the beginning of Chapter 9. We are reading from The Rape of the Mind by Just A.M. Merleau. I don't know if it's going to come into focus or not. It takes a while. Well, it takes too long. But anyway, I will see you in part 2 of this chapter, Chapter 9.